You don't get a say anymore, Dad. This is where broken down old men go to disappear. Vanessa's voice didn't drop when the intake nurse looked up from her clipboard. The hallway held its breath. A floor buffer kept humming somewhere down the corridor, the only sound brave enough to continue. No one coughed. No one moved. My daughter had just called me a broken-down old man in a hallway I had personally poured the concrete for 28 years ago, and she said it the way you'd talk about returning a chair to the curb. If you're new here, welcome. Stories like this one are why I started this channel. Subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. The admissions office at Sunrise Meadows Senior Living smelled like antiseptic and cafeteria gravy. Michael had a folder open on the counter, papers fanned out like a winning hand of cards, guardianship consent, medical power of attorney, a voluntary residency agreement with my signature already forged in pencil, so I could trace over it in pen, my hand guided, my choice erased. 62 years old, and my son-in-law's son was tapping a pen against the counter the way you'd tap it against a slow customer at a car dealership. "Just sign where the tabs are, Harold," he said. "We'll get you settled, and then we can talk about the house later." I looked at the pen. I looked at my daughter, who was studying her phone instead of me, the same way she'd studied her phone at her mother's memorial 3 weeks earlier, scrolling through something that mattered more than the box being lowered into the ground. I looked at the intake nurse, a young woman named Priya, who wouldn't meet my eyes either, because she'd already clocked what was happening and didn't have the authority to stop it. I didn't sign. Not yet. Not because I understood everything that was coming, I didn't. But 40 years of walking construction sites teaches you something courtrooms and hospitals never do. It teaches you to read a structure before you trust your weight to it. And every beam in this room was rotten. I just didn't know yet how deep the rot went, or that the building holding it up belonged, on paper, to me. 3 weeks, that's all it had taken. 3 weeks since Margaret died, and my daughter had gone from grieving stranger to woman, with a folder of legal documents and a floor plan for my disappearance. I need to explain something before I go further, because a story like this only makes sense if you understand what came before the hallway. My name is Harold Kessler. I spent 31 years as a commercial builder in this town, most of that running my own small outfit, Kessler and Sons. Though I never had a son, just Vanessa, and I used to joke that the sign was aspirational. I built strip malls. I built a library annex. I built the elementary school gymnasium where Vanessa played in exactly one basketball game before deciding sports weren't for her. And in 1998, I built this building, Sunrise Meadows. Poured every foundation line myself before I could afford a crew big enough to trust with it. Margaret's father had left her a parcel of land on the edge of town when he passed. 6 acres that nobody wanted because the water table sat wrong for regular housing. Margaret looked at that ugly, unbuildable lot and said, "People are going to need somewhere gentle to grow old. Let's build that instead." I designed it. I built it. And when it came time to put a name on the deed, Margaret's accountant told us to keep it in her name alone, separate from the business, separate from any liability my construction company might someday carry. It made sense at the time. It was supposed to be paperwork. It became, eventually, the reason I am telling you this story at all. We leased the building to an operating company, Meadowcare LLC, the year it opened, and we lived modestly off the rent for decades, while Meadowcare ran the day-to-day. Margaret and I never spent that money on anything showy. Same house for 38 years. Same 2 cars, replaced only when they died. I think, looking back, we were quietly terrified of what money does to people who didn't earn the discipline to hold it. We'd watched it happen to friends. We watched their children circle. We should have watched our own daughter closer. I didn't sign the papers that first night. I told Michael I needed to use the restroom, and instead I walked straight out the front doors of a building I had built with my own 2 hands, got into my truck, and drove to a motel on Route 9 with $60 in my wallet and no idea that I was about to become, quite literally, the landlord of the very place they'd tried to trap me in. The trouble had been building for longer than 3 weeks, though. It just took Margaret's funeral to blow it wide open. She'd been sick for 11 months. Pancreatic cancer. the kind that doesn't leave much room for hope once it introduces itself. I spent those 11 months doing what you do, driving her to Phoenix for treatments, learning to cook the bland things her stomach could tolerate, sitting in waiting rooms with my hands folded like I was praying, though I hadn't prayed regularly since I was a boy. Vanessa visited twice, once in month 2, once in month 9, both times, with Michael trailing behind her, checking his phone in the hallway. I want to be honest here, because Margaret always said honesty about your own blindness was the only kind worth having. I missed things too. When Vanessa was young, I worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7 during a project's final push, and I told myself it was for her, that the sacrifice was the love. I wasn't there for a school play I'd promised to attend. I wasn't there the year she wanted to run track and needed someone to drive her to Saturday practices 40 minutes away. So she quit after 2 months, and I only found out years later that she'd quit because I kept forgetting the drive. I built buildings. I did not always build the parts of my daughter that needed building. I say this not to excuse what came next, but because a man who claims he did nothing wrong his whole life is a man who hasn't looked hard enough. Margaret saw what I couldn't, or wouldn't. In the last 2 months, when the pain medication left her clear-eyed in the mornings before it dulled her by afternoon, she started talking about Vanessa differently. Careful sentences. I don't think she loves people the way she loves things, Harold. I think somewhere we let her learn that things are safer. I told her she was being too hard on our girl. Grief makes people say things. Margaret just looked at me. The particular look she used to give juries, back when she'd worked as a court reporter for 18 years, and had transcribed more human cruelty than most people see in 3 lifetimes. I've watched her with the house, Harold. Have you noticed she doesn't ask how you're doing anymore? She asks what the house is worth. I had noticed. I just hadn't let myself hear it. 2 weeks before she died, Margaret asked me to bring her the small fireproof box from the closet shelf, the one we kept passports and the house title in. She was too weak by then to sit up without help, but her hands were steady when she took a manila envelope out of that box and wrote my name on the front in handwriting that had once been elegant and was now careful, deliberate, fighting the tremor, for Harold. Not until after. She made me promise. Not until after the funeral, Harold. You'll understand why once you see how she treats you when I'm not here to soften it. I promised. I didn't understand. I put the envelope in my jacket pocket at the funeral without opening it, because grief takes up all the room a person has, and there wasn't space that week for anything else. The day after the funeral, Vanessa showed up at the house at 8 in the morning with Michael and a folder. She did not hug me. She set the folder on the kitchen table, the same table Margaret and I had eaten 10,000 meals at, and she said, "We need to talk about arrangements." I thought she meant the headstone. She meant the house. "Dad," she said, "you can't manage this place alone. The stairs, the yard, the bills. Mom always handled the details. We all know that." Michael and I looked into some options, and there's a wonderful facility 20 minutes from us, Sunrise Meadows. It's actually really well regarded. I remember laughing. Not a happy laugh. The kind that comes out before you understand your own shock. "I built Sunrise Meadows," I told her. "Your mother and I own the land it sits on." Vanessa's face did something I want you to picture carefully, because it's the moment I understood something had already been decided before I ever got a vote. She looked at Michael, not at me. A quick glance, the kind married people share when a plan needs adjusting mid-conversation. Then she turned back to me with a patient, slightly pitying smile. The smile you give someone whose memory you've already decided not to trust. "Dad, that company folded years ago. You sold your interest, remember? You've mentioned it before. Actually, more than once, and you get details mixed up sometimes. It's okay. That's kind of the point of what we're suggesting. I had never sold anything. I had never mixed anything up. But I watched my daughter say it with such calm certainty that for one disorienting second, standing in my own kitchen, 3 days after burying my wife, I actually questioned myself. That's the part that still sits wrong with me. Months later, not the eviction, not the folder of forged consent forms. The fact that for 1 second she made me doubt my own mind, and she did it so smoothly I understood she'd rehearsed it. That was the day I learned my daughter had been talking to a lawyer. Not for me, about me. Over the next 2 weeks, it accelerated the way these things do once the machinery starts. Michael, who sold commercial insurance and fancied himself sharper than he was, began stopping by the house alone, always with some reasonable-sounding errand, measuring things with his eyes, the way a man measures a room he's already decided is his. Vanessa started calling twice a day, always circling back to the same 3 subjects: how tired I looked, how the house was too much for one person, how there was no shame in accepting help. I want to be precise about something, because precision matters in a story like this. She never once, in those 2 weeks, asked me how I was doing since losing my wife of 38 years. Not once. She asked about stairs. She asked about bills. She asked gently, delicately, whether I'd been getting confused lately, whether I'd noticed myself forgetting things. I had not been confused. But I began writing things down anyway, dates and conversations, in a small notebook I kept in my jacket, because some old instinct from decades of signing off on inspection reports told me that a man who documents everything is a man who can prove what actually happened when someone else tries to rewrite it. The night before they took me to Sunrise Meadows, I heard them in the driveway. I'd gone out to the garage for something, and my truck blocked the sound of their car doors, so they didn't know I was 20 feet away in the dark, listening the way I used to listen to subcontractors who thought the foreman had already left the site. He's not going to just agree to a home, Michael was saying. Old men don't sign their own commitment papers. We need the doctor's letter first, and we need it to say cognitive decline, not just grief. Grief doesn't hold up for guardianship. Vanessa's voice, tired, flat, not the voice of a woman being talked into something against her will, but the voice of someone already fully inside the plan. I know what it needs to say, Michael. Dr. Ferris already knows what we need. He'll write it. Once we have guardianship, the house sale goes through us, not him. And once that facility placement is finalized, nobody questions where the money goes. Nobody questions where the money goes. I stood in my own dark garage and turned that sentence over like a stone I'd found with something ugly living underneath it. My daughter was not confused about who she was anymore. She had a plan, a doctor, and a folder. And somewhere in that plan I had stopped being her father and become an asset to be relocated. I went back inside before they saw me. I did not confront them that night. 20 years of watching prosecutors work, Margaret's old courthouse stories, decades of dinner table talk about how cases were won not in the shouting but in the waiting, had taught me one thing above all else. You do not show your hand to someone who's already decided how the story ends. You let them play it out, you gather what you need, and you wait for the moment the law itself has no choice but to listen. The next morning, they came for me with the folder, and I let them drive me to Sunrise Meadows without a fight, because I wanted to see exactly how far they intended to go, and because some part of me, the part still raw and grieving and not yet fully awake to what was happening, genuinely wanted to be wrong about my own daughter. I wasn't wrong. In that hallway, under those fluorescent lights, in a building I had personally built, my daughter told me I was a broken-down old man who no longer got a say. And that's when I walked out, drove to a motel, and finally, with shaking hands, opened the envelope Margaret had given me at the funeral. Inside was a deed. Sunrise Meadows Senior Living, 6 acres and the structure upon it, held in the name of the Kessler Family Trust, established 14 years earlier, naming me as sole trustee and successor beneficiary upon Margaret's death. Beneath the deed sat a stack of Meadowcare LLC lease statements going back a decade, rent deposits I'd assumed had stopped when we scaled back our involvement in the business years ago, but which Margaret, it turned out, had quietly kept flowing into a separate account I'd never once looked at, because I'd trusted her with the finances, the same easy way she'd trusted me with the tools. And beneath that, a letter in her handwriting, 2 pages, the ink slightly uneven in places where her hand had trembled. Harold, if you're reading this, our daughter has shown you who she's become, and I am sorrier than I can write down that I couldn't protect you from that truth without also protecting you from her. I started watching her 7 years ago. Really watching. The way I used to watch witnesses on the stand for the tell that means they're not telling the whole truth. She stopped asking about us and started asking about Worth. I didn't want to believe it either. But I kept the trust in my name alone, and I kept the rent statements where you wouldn't stumble onto them, because I knew that if she ever needed somewhere to put you, to get you out of the way of what she wanted, she would choose the one place in this town she'd assume you had no power over. She doesn't know what you built, Harold. She only knows what you let her see. Call James Whitcomb. His number is below. He drew up the trust with me, and he knows exactly what to do. You spent your whole life building shelter for other people's families. It's time you let this one shelter you. There was a business card clipped to the second page. James Whitcomb, attorney at law, trusts and elder estate litigation. A downtown office 3 blocks from the courthouse where Margaret had spent 18 years transcribing other people's worst days. I sat on the edge of a motel bed that smelled like carpet cleaner, wearing the same jacket I'd worn to my wife's funeral, and I read that letter 4 times. Then I looked at the deed again, at the name of the building typed in plain black ink. Sunrise Meadows Senior Living, the place my daughter had just tried to abandon me in like unwanted furniture. She thought she was committing her broken-down old father to a facility he had no say in. She had, without knowing it, committed him to a building he owned. I picked up my phone, dialed the number on the business card, and waited for someone to answer, thinking about my daughter standing in that hallway, telling me I no longer got a say, and thinking that she was about to learn, in very precise legal terms, exactly how wrong she'd been. James Whitcomb's office sat above a coffee shop on 4th Street, the kind of building with a narrow staircase and a brass plate by the door that hadn't been polished in years, which I liked immediately, because polish is often what people buy when the substance underneath is thin. He answered his own phone that first night, which told me something too, Mr. Kessler. His voice had the particular calm of a man who had been expecting this call for longer than he'd hoped he would. I'm very sorry about Margaret. She was a remarkable client, and an even better friend to this office. Can you come in tomorrow morning? Bring everything in that envelope. I told him I could. He told me one more thing before we hung up, and it's the sentence that kept me from sleeping that night, though not from fear. Mr. Kessler, don't sign anything else, don't contact your daughter, and don't go back to that facility until we've talked. I didn't need to be told twice. I spent that first night in the motel doing something I hadn't done in years, laying out documents on a bedspread the way I used to lay out blueprints, looking for load-bearing points, the places where the whole structure either holds or fails. Deed, trust document, a decade of lease statements, Margaret's letter, and underneath all of it, a folded scrap of yellow legal paper I almost missed. One more thing she'd tucked into the envelope almost as an afterthought. It was a receipt, handwritten, dated 11 years earlier, from a home security company, one motion-activated camera, installed above the garage. Margaret's signature at the bottom, not mine. I remembered the camera. I'd never once questioned why she'd wanted it, and I'd certainly never checked the footage in years, because Margaret had always been the one who handled that account. Same as she'd handled the rent statements, same as she'd quietly handled so much I'd let slide past me while I was out pouring concrete for other people's futures. I didn't understand yet why that receipt mattered. I would, soon enough. Whitcomb's office the next morning was small and unglamorous, files stacked in towers that looked precarious but were probably organized by a mind sharper than the mess suggested. He was younger than I expected, maybe 50, with the kind of steady eye contact that made you feel like every word you said was being weighed on a scale somewhere behind his glasses. He read through everything, without speaking for almost 20 minutes. When he finally looked up, he tapped the deed twice with one finger. You understand what you're holding, he said. Not a question. A confirmation he needed me to say out loud. The way Margaret used to say, a witness needs to hear themselves speak the truth before it becomes real to them. I own the building, I said. The one my daughter tried to put me in. You own the land and the building outright. Through a trust your wife established 14 years ago, naming you sole trustee upon her death. Meadowcare LLC operates the facility under a commercial lease that pays into that trust monthly. As of Margaret's passing, that income and full authority over that lease belongs to you. Not to your daughter, not to anyone but you. I sat with that for a moment. 20 minutes ago, I'd been a man who'd been told he no longer got a say. Now I was being told, in a small cluttered office that smelled like old paper and stronger coffee than I usually drank, that I held more authority in this situation than my daughter could possibly imagine. There's more, Whitcomb said, and this is the part you need to hear carefully. Your daughter and her husband attempted to place you into a facility using forged consent documents and what appears to be a coordinated effort to secure a medical letter alleging cognitive decline, correct? I told him what I'd overheard in the driveway. He wrote it down without looking surprised, which told me this pattern wasn't new to him. That's attempted fraud, and depending on how far they went with the physician, potentially conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse. Arizona takes this seriously, Mr. Kessler. Very seriously. We're going to file 2 things this week. First, we file to formally establish your competency and your sole authority as trustee, which shuts down any guardianship attempt before it starts. Second, and I want you to think carefully before you answer this, we file to terminate the operating lease with Medocare LLC and either replace the operator or restructure the facility's management, effective immediately upon notice. That stopped me. You're talking about throwing hundreds of elderly residents into chaos, I said. I built that place so people would have somewhere gentle to be. I'm not going to let my daughter's greed turn into their eviction. Whitcomb almost smiled. The first real expression I'd seen from him. Good, he said, because that's not actually what I'm proposing. Medocare's residents stay exactly where they are. What changes is who signs the checks, who has decision-making authority, and whether your daughter and son-in-law retain the standing they've apparently built inside that building over the past several months. That last part landed strange in my chest, a small cold stone, dropping somewhere it hadn't been before. What do you mean, standing they've built? What standing? He turned his laptop toward me. It's a small thing, he said, but it isn't nothing. Medocare's administrator, a man named Gerald Ashworth, has been the facility's operating director for 6 years. Public records show your son-in-law's insurance agency underwrites Medocare's liability policy, a contract signed 8 months ago. Around the same time, county placement records show a noticeable increase in intake referrals routed specifically through Michael Clark's office. I didn't understand the shape of what he was describing yet, not fully, but I understood the temperature of it. That's not a coincidence, I said. I don't deal in coincidence, Mr. Kessler. I deal in filings. We'll find out exactly what it is. But I wanted you to know that whatever brought your daughter to choose this specific facility for you, it likely wasn't sentiment. I left his office 2 hours later, having signed representation papers, having agreed to a court filing that would go out within the week, and carrying a folder of my own documents that Whitcomb had photocopied for safekeeping. I drove back to the motel instead of my house, because Whitcomb had been clear on one point above all others. Don't go home yet, Mr. Kessler. Let them believe they're still winning. It gives us room to work, and it gives them room to make a mistake. I understood that instinct in my bones. 40 years of construction had taught me that the load a structure can bear only reveals itself under pressure. And I wanted to see exactly how much weight my daughter's story could hold before it started to crack. It cracked faster than I expected. 3 days after Whitcomb filed the competency petition and the lease termination notice, Vanessa called me. I let it go to voicemail the first 2 times. The third time I answered, mostly because I wanted to hear, in real time, what version of the truth she was building now that the ground beneath her had started to shift. Dad, her voice had a brittleness I hadn't heard before, something underneath the practiced patience of the last month. We got some paperwork from a lawyer. This has to be some kind of mistake. You don't have a lawyer. You don't handle things like this. Mom always. Your mother handled a great many things I didn't know about, I said. That's rather the point. Silence on the line. Long enough that I could hear Michael's voice somewhere behind her, muffled, asking something. Then Vanessa again, quieter now. Dad, please, we were trying to help you. You weren't doing well after Mom died. You seemed lost, we thought. I want to stop here and tell you something, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not raise my voice. I did not call her a liar, though I could have. I thought of my wife's letter, of the particular restraint she'd shown for years, watching, documenting, never once confronting our daughter directly until the moment the evidence could speak for itself. I understood, in that phone call, exactly what Margaret had been protecting all along. Not the money, not even the building. She'd been protecting the version of events, so that when the truth finally came out, it would come out through documents and dates and receipts, not through a grieving old man's word against his own daughters. "I'm not lost, Vanessa," I said. "I built that building with my own hands before you were born. I know exactly where I am." She hung up on me. The calls stopped after that for 4 days, which in hindsight should have worried me more than it did. Silence from Vanessa had never once, in her entire adult life, meant retreat. It meant regrouping. On the 5th day, Whitcomb called with 2 pieces of news, one that made the case stronger, and one that made my hands go cold around the phone. The first, he told me they'd located Dr. Ferris, the physician Vanessa and Michael had approached to write a cognitive decline letter. Ferris had, to his credit, refused, on the grounds that he'd never examined me and had no clinical basis for such a diagnosis. But records showed a second physician, a Dr. Alan Weiss, who worked part-time at a walk-in clinic and had a history of disciplinary complaints with the state medical board, had signed a letter 3 days after Ferris's refusal, stating I exhibited signs of moderate cognitive impairment consistent with early dementia, based on an exam that, according to the clinic's own intake logs, had lasted 6 minutes and had never actually happened in my presence. "They forged the exam," I said. "They fabricated the exam," Whitcomb corrected, "which is worse, legally speaking. That's fraud on a medical record, and it's the backbone of any elder abuse case a prosecutor would want." The second piece of news was the one that turned my stomach. Meadowcare's administrator, Gerald Ashworth, had accelerated my admission paperwork, backdating the intended move-in date, and quietly initiating a change of representative payee form with the Social Security Administration, listing Vanessa as my new representative payee for benefits, a form that, had it gone through before Whitcomb's filing landed, would have redirected my entire monthly income to my daughter's control without my knowledge. "They weren't just trying to put me somewhere out of the way," I said slowly. "They were building a machine to take everything, piece by piece, before anyone noticed I was gone. That's precisely what it looks like, Mr. Kessler." I thought about the hallway again, the buffer humming. My daughter's voice, flat and certain, telling me I no longer got a say. I understood now that she hadn't been speaking casually in a moment of stress. She'd been reciting a conclusion she and Michael had already reached weeks earlier. One step in a plan with forms and dates, and a compromised doctor, and an administrator willing to backdate paperwork for reasons Whitcomb suspected, but hadn't yet proven involved money changing hands somewhere along that chain. The hearing date came through 2 weeks later. Maricopa County Superior Court, Probate Division, before a judge named Renata Alvarez, known, Whitcomb told me with the faintest trace of satisfaction, for having zero patience for guardianship petitions built on shaky medical grounds. In the meantime, something happened I hadn't expected. I drove past Sunrise Meadows one evening, not intending to stop, just needing to see the building from the outside, the way you sometimes need to look at something you built to remind yourself it's still standing. A woman was sitting on the bench near the entrance in a nurse's cardigan. Smoking a cigarette, she looked like she needed badly. I recognized her. Priya, from the intake desk, the one who wouldn't meet my eyes the day they tried to admit me. She saw my truck, and to my surprise, walked over. "I need to tell you something," she said, glancing back at the building like she was checking whether anyone had followed her out. "I've worked here 4 years. I love these residents. But something's been wrong for months. Mr. Ashworth's been pushing intake numbers hard, telling us to fill beds fast, sign families up before they change their minds. And a few weeks ago I heard him on the phone with someone, talking about a bonus structure tied to referrals from an insurance office. I didn't think much of it until your daughter brought you in and you clearly didn't want to be here. And Mr. Ashworth told me not to log your reluctance in the intake notes. I asked her if she'd be willing to say that to a lawyer. She hesitated, the particular hesitation of someone weighing a paycheck against a conscience, then said yes. I have kids, she said. I can't lose this job. But I also can't keep pretending I didn't see what I saw. I gave her Whitcomb's card. It felt, standing in that parking lot under a sky going orange with the last of the sunset, like the first piece of something larger sliding into place, the kind of moment on a job site, when you realize the structural problem you thought was isolated to one beam actually runs through the whole frame of the building. And once you see it, you can't stop seeing it everywhere. I want to tell you about a moment that happened that same week, because it's the part of this story that has nothing to do with lawyers or deeds, and everything to do with what I was actually grieving underneath all of it. I was back at my own house by then, Whitcomb having decided there was no longer any legal reason for me to hide out in a motel once the competency petition was filed. I was sitting in the kitchen one evening, at the table where Vanessa had once set down her folder, and I found myself, without really deciding to, taking out that old photo album Margaret kept in the hallway closet, Vanessa at 5, missing her front teeth, holding my hand at the county fair. Vanessa at 11, sitting on my shoulders so she could see over a construction fence at the library annex going up, asking me 100 questions about cranes. Vanessa at 16, furious with me for missing something. I don't remember what anymore. And Margaret in the background of that photo, watching us both with an expression I understood now, looking back as worry. Not about the argument, about what the argument was made of. I sat with those photographs a long time. I am not, by nature, a man who cries easily, and I want to be honest that I didn't fully break down that night. But I felt something crack quietly in my chest. Some old certainty that the daughter in those photographs and the woman in that hallway were somehow still connected by more than blood, that there was a version of her, still reachable if I just found the right door. I don't know if that's true, I still don't, even now, but I let myself feel it that night, at the kitchen table, alone, because Margaret had always told me that a man who refuses to grieve what he's lost usually ends up taking it out on what he still has. I also thought, sitting there, about my own failures, about the track practices I forgot, about the 6-day weeks. I am not writing this story to paint myself as blameless, because I wasn't. I built her a house, and I built her a childhood with plenty of walls, but not always enough windows. And somewhere in that gap between providing and truly seeing her, something had gone hungry in my daughter that neither of us had known how to feed, honestly. That doesn't excuse what she did. Nothing excuses what she did. But I needed, that night, to hold both truths at once, my own old failures, and her very deliberate present choice to exploit a dying woman's grieving husband, because Margaret had taught me that the truth is rarely one clean thing, and a man who only sees his own innocence usually stops seeing everything else too. The hearing was 6 days away. I closed the album, put it back on the shelf, and went to bed early for the first time in weeks, because I had a feeling, the same feeling I used to get the night before a big pour, that tomorrow was going to require everything I had left. The morning of the hearing, I put on the same navy suit I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, because it was the only suit I owned that still fit properly. And there was something fitting, I thought, in wearing grief to a courtroom that was about to determine whether I'd get to keep grieving in my own home. Whitcomb met me in the courthouse lobby with his briefcase already organized, exhibits tabbed and labeled the way I used to label load calculations on a blueprint, everything in its place before the pressure test began. He looked calmer than I felt. They filed a response, he told me as we rode the elevator up. Their attorney is a man named Doug Pruitt. Not a bad lawyer, but not a great one either. And I don't think he fully understands yet what he's walked into. Judge Alvarez's courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, a single row of spectator benches on each side. Vanessa and Michael sat with Pruitt at their table, and I want to describe what I saw when I walked in, because it told me something before a single word was spoken. Vanessa looked thinner than she had a month earlier, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and she would not look at me. Michael, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair with the loose, overconfident posture of a man who still believed he had the winning hand, checking his watch like the whole proceeding was an inconvenience standing between him and lunch. All rise. The bailiff's voice cut through the room, and Judge Alvarez entered, a woman in her 60s with sharp, quick eyes that moved across both tables before she'd even sat down. The eyes of someone who had heard every excuse a courtroom could offer and had stopped being impressed by most of them years ago. Case number 25 PR 4471. In the matter of the trusteeship and competency of Harold Kessler, she opened the file. Mr. Whitcomb, you're representing the petitioner. Yes, Your Honor. Whitcomb stood. This matter concerns two related issues. First, confirmation of Mr. Kessler's full mental competency and sole trusteeship over the Kessler Family Trust, which holds title to the land and building operating as Sunrise Meadows Senior Living. Second, we're asking the court to formally void a residency placement and representative payee change initiated against Mr. Kessler through fraudulent means. Pruitt stood, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, my clients acted in good faith, out of genuine concern for Mr. Kessler's well-being following the recent loss of his wife. There's a medical letter documenting cognitive concerns. That letter, Whitcomb interrupted, gently but firmly, was signed by a physician who never examined Mr. Kessler. We have the clinic's own intake log showing no appointment ever took place. Judge Alvarez's eyebrows lifted slightly. That's a serious allegation, Mr. Whitcomb. Present your evidence. What followed took nearly 2 hours, and I won't walk through every exhibit, because a courtroom is slower than any story about one, full of pauses and procedural corrections that don't translate into drama. But I'll tell you the moments that mattered. Whitcomb entered the trust document and the deed first, establishing beyond any argument that I owned the land and building outright, that Vanessa had no legal claim to either, and that any suggestion I'd sold my interest years earlier, the claim she'd made standing in my kitchen days after the funeral, was demonstrably false. Judge Alvarez read the deed twice, slowly. The way a person reads something they want to be certain they're not misunderstanding. Then he called Priya Anand. She walked to the stand in her scrubs, having come straight from a shift, hands trembling slightly as she raised her right hand to be sworn in. I watched Vanessa's face when Priya's name was announced. Something flickered there, the first real crack I'd seen in her composure since this began. Miss Anand, Whitcomb said, can you describe what you were instructed to do and not do on the day Mr. Kessler was brought in for intake? Priya's voice shook at first, then steadied. Mr. Ashworth told me not to log the resident's reluctance in the intake notes. He said families sometimes get cold feet if they see hesitation written down formally, that it complicates the paperwork. He told me to mark the admission as voluntary regardless. And had you observed anything else, in the months prior, regarding intake practices at the facility? Pruitt objected on relevance. Judge Alvarez overruled him. And I watched her lean forward slightly, the way you lean towards something you've decided you need to hear clearly. Priya described the pressure to fill beds quickly, the bonus conversations she'd overheard between Ashworth and someone on the phone, conversations she hadn't understood the significance of until she connected them, weeks later, to my own admission. Then Whitcomb called a forensic accountant Margaret's old rent statements had allowed him to hire on short notice, a sharp, quiet woman named Deborah Ossie, who walked the court through banking records subpoenaed from Meadowcare LLC. 8 months ago, a series of payments totaling just under $30,000 had moved from a Meadowcare operating account into a consulting fee paid to Clark Insurance Solutions, Michael's agency, structured as underwriting commissions but timed suspiciously close to a spike in intake referrals, routed specifically through Michael's office. And 2 weeks before my admission, a separate payment of $4,000 had gone directly to Gerald Ashworth's personal account from an entity registered to Michael Clark. That's not underwriting commission, Ossie said. When Whitcomb asked her to characterize the payment, that's structured like a personal kickback for a specific placement. I watched Michael's face when those numbers were read into the record. The confident lean forward in his chair I'd seen at the start of the hearing was gone entirely. He was gripping the edge of the table now, jaw tight, and beside him, Vanessa had turned to look at him directly. For the first time all morning, her expression sliding from confusion into something colder. "You paid him," she said, quiet enough that I almost didn't catch it, but not quiet enough for the room. "You told me it was insurance paperwork." Pruitt tried to quiet her. She didn't quiet. "Michael," she said, louder now, "you told me the bonus structure was standard practice. You told me this was about Dad getting good care." "Order," Judge Alvarez said, not unkindly but firmly. "Miss Clark, I understand this is difficult. I need you to remain composed." But something had shifted, and everyone in that room felt it. My daughter, the woman who 3 weeks earlier had stood in a hallway and told me I no longer got a say, was sitting at that table, realizing in real time in front of a judge that her husband had been running a financial scheme underneath the family drama she thought she was orchestrating, that she had been, in some sense I hadn't expected and took no pleasure in discovering, a tool inside someone else's plan as much as she had been its architect. It didn't make what she'd done to me any less real. I want to be clear about that. She had chosen to believe a lie about my competency because it was convenient. She had chosen to speak to me the way she did in that hallway. Nobody forced those words out of her mouth. But watching her face collapse as the numbers were read, I understood for the first time that greed rarely operates alone, that it usually finds a partner willing to sharpen it into something more efficient and more cruel than it would have managed by itself. Whitcomb moved to close the fraudulent medical letter, entering into the record a statement from Dr. Ferris, confirming he'd refused to write it, alongside the fabricated exam notes from Dr. Weiss, whose signature, it turned out, was already under review by the State Medical Board for 2 prior similar incidents involving other elderly patients at different facilities. By the time Whitcomb rested, the courtroom had the particular stillness of a structure that everyone in the room understood was about to come down. The quiet before a controlled demolition when the charges are set, and everyone's just waiting for the countdown. Judge Alvarez looked at Pruitt. "Counsel, anything further from the respondents?" Pruitt glanced at his clients, and for a moment I thought he might try to salvage something. Instead, he said, quietly, "No further evidence, Your Honor." And I could see in his posture that he already understood there was nothing left worth defending. Judge Alvarez took off her glasses and set them down, the gesture of someone about to speak plainly rather than read from notes. "Mr. Kessler's competency is not in question. The medical letter submitted in support of the respondent's guardianship petition was fabricated, and I am referring that matter to the county attorney's office, along with the intake and payment records, suggesting a coordinated scheme to profit from Mr. Kessler's placement without his informed consent. The trust and deed clearly establish Mr. Kessler as sole owner of the property in question. Any representative payee change initiated on his behalf is voided immediately, and Mr. Clark." She looked directly at Michael, and I watched him try to hold her gaze and fail. "The payments described today, on their face, appear to constitute fraud against your own client's health insurer, as well as financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I'm ordering this matter referred for criminal investigation. You may want to retain separate counsel from your wife going forward, because your interests in this matter are no longer the same." The gavel came down. I sat very still, the way I used to stand at the edge of a finished building right after the final inspection passed, feeling less triumph than a strange, heavy quiet, the sense of a long pressure finally releasing. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Michael left fast, alone, without looking at Vanessa, already on his phone, presumably calling whatever lawyer he thought could save him from what was coming. Vanessa stood near the elevator bank, and for a long moment neither of us moved toward the other. Then she said quietly, not the rehearsed patience of the last month, but something rawer underneath it, "Dad, I didn't know about the money. I swear I didn't know he was taking payments." "I believe you didn't know the specifics," I said. "I don't believe you didn't know something was wrong." She didn't argue with that. She just stood there. And for the first time since Margaret's funeral, I saw something in her face that looked less like calculation and more like a woman realizing, all at once, how far down she'd let herself be led, and how little solid ground was left beneath her. I turned and walked toward the elevator without saying anything else. Whitcomb fell into step beside me, and neither of us spoke until we were outside in the parking structure, standing in the flat afternoon light. "Congratulations, Mr. Kessler," he said. "The trust is fully secured. Sunrise Meadows is yours to run as you see fit." I looked back toward the courthouse doors, thinking about Margaret, about the letter, about a woman who had watched her own daughter drift somewhere she couldn't reach for 7 quiet years, and had spent that time not confronting, not lecturing, but building patiently a structure strong enough to hold me up once she was gone. It didn't feel like winning, I told Whitcomb. It felt like finding out how much of the house was already hollow. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods who has stood beside a lot of people at exactly this moment before. "That's usually what it feels like," he said. "The winning part comes later, if it comes at all. One orchestrated narrative arc with emotional crescendos and symbolic details. The county attorney's office moved faster than Whitcomb expected. Within 3 weeks, Michael was formally charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and insurance fraud, the kickback scheme unraveling further once investigators subpoenaed Clark Insurance Solutions and found the same pattern repeated at 2 other senior facilities across the county. Families who'd been quietly steered toward placements that paid Michael a commission dressed up as underwriting fees. His insurance license was suspended pending the outcome, and 2 of his largest carrier partnerships dropped him within the week, the kind of professional collapse that doesn't wait for a verdict to start doing its damage. Gerald Ashworth resigned from Sunrise Meadows before I could formally remove him, which Whitcomb told me was common. The sort of quiet exit men make when they know the paperwork against them is already better organized than any defense they could mount. I didn't chase him. I had a building full of people who needed stability more than I needed the satisfaction of firing him myself. What I want to tell you about next isn't about punishment. It's about what happened in the weeks after, because that's the part of this story that actually changed something in me. I hired a new administrator within 2 weeks, a woman named Carol Ibsen who'd run a nonprofit senior care network for 15 years, and cried genuinely when I told her during the interview why the position had opened up. I gave Priya a permanent raise and moved her into a coordinator role, because a person who tells the truth when it costs her something deserves to be rewarded for it, not just thanked. I sat with residents in the common room some afternoons, not as the owner exactly, just as a man who'd once poured the foundation under their feet and wanted, now, to understand what daily life actually felt like inside a building he'd only ever seen from a contractor's clipboard. An elderly woman named Ruth, who'd lived at Sunrise Meadows for 6 years, told me one afternoon, unprompted, that the light in the east hallway had always made her feel like she was already somewhere better than the life she'd left behind. I hadn't designed that light for sentiment. I'd designed it because the east-facing windows caught the morning sun, and I'd wanted the residents to wake up somewhere warm. It had never occurred to me, in all my years as a builder, that the technical decisions I made with a slide rule and a set of blueprints might end up meaning something that's specific to somebody's actual life. I sat with Ruth a long while that afternoon. I didn't say much. I just let myself feel fully, for the first time since Margaret died, that the work of my life had mattered in ways I'd never bothered to go looking for. Vanessa reached out 11 days after the hearing. Not a call. An email, subject line simply, "I'm sorry." Sent late at night, the kind of hour when people write the things they've been avoiding saying out loud. "Dad, I don't have an excuse, and I'm not going to try to build one. I let Michael convince me you were becoming a burden, because it was easier than admitting I hadn't visited enough while Mom was sick, hadn't called enough after, and I think somewhere I needed you to be a problem to solve instead of a father I'd been failing. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth as close as I can get to it right now. I know I don't deserve to ask for anything. I'm asking anyway. Would you be willing to see me? Just once. Lily keeps asking about you." I hadn't known, until that line, that Vanessa had a daughter now, a granddaughter I'd never met, 6 years old. Born during a stretch of years when Vanessa and I had drifted into the kind of distance that neither of us had ever formally chosen, the kind that just accumulates, one skipped call at a time, until it hardens into something that feels permanent, even though nobody ever decided it should be. I sat with that email for 2 days before responding. I want to be honest that some part of me wanted to refuse outright, to let the silence stand as its own kind of verdict. But I kept thinking about Margaret's letter, about the particular grace and how she'd handled this, watching, documenting, never cutting Vanessa off entirely, even in her most clear-eyed moments of disappointment, because Margaret believed, right up until the end, that people could still surprise you if you left the door open even a crack. I agreed to meet her, not at the house. At Sunrise Meadows, in the small garden courtyard I'd designed off the east wing, the one with the light Ruth loved so much, Vanessa arrived on a Thursday afternoon holding a small girl's hand, and I want to describe the moment I saw them coming across the courtyard because it's the moment this whole story turns on more than any court hearing ever could. Vanessa looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way she carried herself, the practiced confidence of the woman who'd stood in that hallway and told me I no longer got a say, entirely gone, replaced by something uncertain and unguarded that I hadn't seen in her since she was young enough to still fall asleep against my shoulder in the car. Lily let go of her mother's hand and ran ahead, stopping in front of me with the fearless directness only children manage before the world teaches them caution. "Are you the grandpa who builds houses?" she asked. "I build lots of things," I told her. "This building, actually. A long time ago." She looked around the courtyard, at the flowers, at the old residents dozing in the shade, at the light falling warm through the east-facing windows Ruth loved, and she asked the question that undid something in me faster than any legal victory had managed. "If you built it for old people to be happy, why did Mommy say it was a place to put you away?" The courtyard went quiet. Vanessa's face crumpled, not gracefully, not the composed sorrow she'd shown at the hearing, but something raw and unguarded, a grown woman standing in front of her father and her daughter, undone by a 6-year-old's plain honesty in a way that no courtroom exhibit had managed to undo her. "I don't know why," baby Vanessa said, her voice breaking. "I think I forgot who he was for a little while. I want to tell you what happened next, because it's the part I still think about more than the verdict." Vanessa crossed the courtyard and put her arms around me, the first time she'd hugged me since before Margaret's diagnosis, and I felt her shaking against my shoulder the way she used to shake as a girl after a nightmare, and something in me that had been braced, tight, held rigid since that hallway 3 months earlier, finally let go. I'm not going to pretend that hug fixed everything. It didn't. Trust doesn't rebuild in a single afternoon in a garden courtyard, no matter how good the light is. But I held my daughter while she cried, and over her shoulder I watched Lily wander toward the flower beds, picking at a marigold with the easy curiosity of a child who didn't yet know how heavy the last 3 months had actually been, and I thought, this is worth more than the deed, worth more than the trust, worth more than every dollar that building had ever earned. I need to tell you something else, because Margaret always said the truth is rarely one clean thing. I hadn't been blameless either. Standing there in that courtyard, I found myself saying something I hadn't planned to say, something that had been sitting in my chest since the night I looked through that photo album alone at the kitchen table. "I miss things too," I told Vanessa, once she'd pulled back and wiped her face. "Track practice. Your school plays." I told myself the long hours were for you, and maybe some of that was true, but I also let work become the easier thing to give you, because it asked less of me than actually sitting with you and finding out what you needed. I'm not saying that excuses what happened. Nothing excuses what happened. But I want you to know I've been looking at my own failures too, not just yours. She didn't say anything right away. She just nodded. And something in her shoulders loosened. The particular relief of a person who has spent weeks steeling herself for a conversation that turns out to be less about blame than she feared, and more about two flawed people trying to find their way back toward each other slowly, honestly, without pretending either of them had been perfect. I want to tell you what happened at Sunrise Meadows 2 months later, because it's where this story actually ends, or at least where it finds its resting place. We held a small dedication ceremony in that same courtyard, renaming it the Margaret Kessler Garden, a modest bronze plaque set into the stone path near the marigolds. I hadn't expected many people to come. I was wrong. Residents wheeled themselves out to the edges of the courtyard. Priya stood near the back with her own young daughter on her hip. Ruth sat in her usual spot by the east windows, smiling in a way that made the whole afternoon feel worth it on its own. And along the back fence, without anyone organizing it, without anyone being asked, a dozen men in their 60s and 70s showed up quietly. Men I recognized after a moment as former crew from Kessler and Sons, guys I hadn't worked alongside in 20 years, standing there in flannel shirts and work boots because somebody had mentioned the ceremony to somebody else, and they'd wanted to be there for the man who'd once signed their paychecks, and apparently meant more to them than I'd ever fully understood while I was too busy running the job site to notice. Nobody made speeches about revenge that day. Nobody mentioned Michael's pending trial, or Ashworth's quiet disgrace, or the county attorney's office building its case in some office none of us would ever see. I said a few words about Margaret, about the 6 ugly acres she'd inherited, and insisted on turning into somewhere gentle, about a woman who'd spent the last 7 years of her life quietly protecting a husband she knew wouldn't see the danger coming until it was standing in his own kitchen. Vanessa stood beside me during the ceremony, Lily's small hand in hers, and when I finished speaking, she reached over and took my hand too. The 3 of us standing there together, in the light Margaret's inheritance had made possible, in a building I'd built with my own 2 hands, in a garden that finally had her name on it. I think about that hallway sometimes, the one where my daughter told me I no longer got a say, where the floor buffer kept humming in the silence after her words landed. I walk through it now most weeks, checking on residents, talking to Carol about the new activity schedule, stopping to let Ruth tell me another story about the light. Nobody in that hallway looks at me now, the way Vanessa did that day, like I was something already halfway disposed of. They know whose name is on the deed. More than that, I think at least some of them have started to know whose name deserves to be remembered for what this building actually became. Margaret used to tell me that people build monuments to the wrong things, that a house or a fortune only matters if it protects the people who genuinely need protecting, not the people who simply demand it loudest. I understand that now in a way I didn't before she died. I built a business out of concrete and steel for 30 years, and it turned out the sturdiest thing I ever built was a trust document my wife quietly signed in a lawyer's office 14 years earlier, patient enough to wait for a day she'd never lived to see, so that when her husband finally needed shelter, he'd find out he'd owned it all along. If you're new here, thank you for staying until the end. If this story meant something to you, please like the video, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments where you were listening from.